Hi everyone, I'm Charlene Habermeyer of Good Parenting, Brighter Children, and this is Tidbits of Wisdom for Parents. Today we're going to talk about a very important subject, and I feel like most of these subjects I'm talking about are important. But this one is how music affects the learning disabled. There's a couple of reasons. I've written about this extensively in my book, Good Music, Brighter Children. And there's a big reason why. In fact, the reason that I wrote Good Music, Brighter Children was because of my third son, Brandon, who was severely learning disabled. What I want to tell you, and this is an interesting statistic, is 1 out of every 4 children now that enter school have some kind of learning problem. Okay, that's 25% of kids today have some kind of learning problem. And it goes the entire gamut from the autism spectrum to the ADHD and everything else in between. So to briefly tell you, I'm doing this in 2 parts because it's quite extensive, but I'll tell you briefly about my son. Okay, it was my 3rd son. My doctor was going out of town and he wanted to induce my labor, and that's what he did. One question I remember asking him very specifically was he down low enough? And the doctor assured me that he was, but he was not. Okay, so I went in, they induced my labor, and he was delivered by forceps, but he was way up high in the birth canal, and they literally had those forceps way up there, and they drug him out. Now, I did not know, I was young and I was stupid and I didn't know the important, what happens with the birth. Nowadays, you can read a ton of information of all the different things that can go wrong with the birth and a lot of things that do go wrong with the birth that leaves a child learning disabled. Okay, we did not know anything, any correlation, any connection to Brandon and his learning disabilities until we started having him professionally tested. And the very first thing that they asked us and they wanted to know in detail was his birth. Later on, when we had brain scans done of his brain, we found the brain damage that had been inflicted basically at birth. And on the inner skull, you could still see the indentations of the forceps. Okay, so Brandon, I read to my kids from day one in utero, took books with me to the hospital, played classical music, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so with Brandon, it was totally different. By the age of 3, we still couldn't understand him. Instead of reading 5 books a day to him, like I did to each one of the other children, I was reading 10 books a day to him. And it didn't seem like anything was, clicking with him. He also had constant ear infections. Now, my oldest son also had constant ear infections. He had had 24 by the time he was 2. Our family has narrow eustachian tubes, but it didn't affect him, our oldest son. But Brandon, for some reason, it did. And it was like he was hearing sounds like in a vacuum. So he wasn't being able to even hear the sounds of all the books and everything that I was reading to him. Okay, so that affected his speech and language. So by the age of 3, because he had a language that we could not understand, I had him tested, and yes, he was delayed, and he started with speech and language. Now, speech and language can or cannot be a red flag that there are more problems coming. There are kids that I know, one of my granddaughters, she had speech and language issues. She went into them. That was her only issue. A really good friend of mine, that was her daughter's only issue. It was just speech and language. They got them into therapy, and within a couple of 2, 3, 4 years, they were perfectly fine. But for other kids, it tends to be a red flag that there is more to come. So he was in that, and I thought that everything would be okay. But what I did notice with him in preschool is his small motor development and his gross motor development was also delayed. It also seemed to be behind. When he started in kindergarten, he started in September. Of October of that year, the teacher brought me in and said, I think there's some problems here. She said, he's a sweet little boy, he's kind, he's not disruptive, but she says he kind of stares out the window. She says, I think that he has some learning issues. I was very grateful to her, so what I did is I ended up having him tested through the schools and privately. And what came back was pretty dismal. He came back, and I'll just make this short, that he had severe learning disabilities. They said they were so severe that it would be doubtful if he graduated from college or high school, and college was pretty much out of the question. He had visual motor, visual perception, visual spatial. He had auditory processing. He had attention deficit disorder, but they said without the hyperactivity, which is rather unusual. He had dysgraphia. He had a lot of anxiety when that we noticed when my husband and I left, to go on a date or whatever. He had tremendous separation anxiety. So there was all different kinds of things. Now, I didn't know a thing about learning disabilities. And this was before the age of the internet. With a flick of the wrist, you can find out all kinds of information and all kinds of help. So I had to network with other mothers who were also dealing with learning disabled kids and the different programs that they put them in. And I had to go to the library and use what's called the microfiche. I'm sure that is a term you've never heard before. And so I had to get on that microfiche and I had to look for articles and different things that were written. So I had Brandon in a number of different programs. Like I mentioned, we were in speech and language. I also, because he had tracking issues, he had the visual motor problems with his eyes, I put him and I had him work with a behavioral optometrist. Now, my pediatrician just about had a coronary over this. She thought that they were bad and, blah, blah, blah. Well, since then, Brandon was born in 1982. All these problems were diagnosed in 1988. A lot has happened since that time. They now give behavioral optometrists a lot of credence for what they do. They do help the eyes. In fact, at the time, I had Brandon working with this behavioral optometrist, and I had him working with an educational therapist, and we had him in another program. The only person out of all those three programs was the behavioral optometrist who said, I think he is going to start to read, which in fact, a week later he was reading, but he did have the tracking issues. He would read one line, then he would skip and go down 2 or 3 lines. That is all helped with behavioral optometry. We also had him in the Linda Mood Bell program, which helped him with auditory processing. Usually, and this is a huge red flag, almost every single learning disability out there starts with auditory processing, meaning they can hear fine, but they're not processing what they're hearing, okay? When you're teaching a child how to read, they have to use their ears first before they use their eyes, so they have to be able to hear the nuances and the sounds of each one of those letters. That is auditory processing. The Linda Mood Bell program was excellent. However, I opted to go with somebody who was doing the program over a year. Twice a week I took Brandon. She gave us different things that we were to do. Now, I had 2 other friends that wanted to do the fast track program, which I think was 6 to 8 weeks. It was done every single day. My success with Brandon was a lot better than them cramming it into a very short period of time. Now, I've also since that time read a ton of books about the brain, how kids learn, the whole process of it. And our brain learns at a slower pace. If we cram everything in, it's like throwing a bucket of water on them. So if you look into that program, and again, I talk about it in my book, I would opt for the one over a year's time or whatever. Also, Brandon had sensory integration issues. This is when all of your senses, and by the way, we don't have 5 senses, we have 9 senses. They're not integrating, and all of those senses have to work together because it helps with cognition and learning. So we had him at the Gene Ayers Clinic, the Ayers Clinic in California. He went there a couple of times a week and he worked with occupational therapists in that program. We also took him to the Doheny Eye Institute because Brandon, because of the behavioral optometry, he did have to wear glasses. The Doheny Eye Institute, they did some extra things on his glasses. And I took him to the Erlin Institute in Long Beach, California. That has to do with scotopic sensitivity syndrome. Some kids are very sensitive to certain colors. Brandon went through that. He also had that. We did colored overlays. All of this helped him. All of this helped him to start to learn. Now, this was a painstaking process. This is not something that happened that we did in 1 year and all of a sudden, he jumped to the head of the class. This was year after year after year of developing and helping the brain. Those areas of the brain that were damaged from the birth, we had to re-help them. And the brain is amazing because it can heal. It can rejuvenate itself. Miraculous things can happen. So, this is going to be my bonus fact that I'll give you. The interesting thing is Brandon, of all the women that I met, Brandon had the most severe learning disabilities. We compared, contrasted all the different testing that had been done. But Brandon was advancing far more rapidly than all of their kids were. So they sat me down one day and they said, okay, wait a minute, are you holding out on us? What program are you doing that we're not doing, that we need to get our kids involved in so that they will be, that they will advance as quick as Brandon is? So as I went through everything, the only thing that was different that we were doing with Brandon was that he was involved with music. To me, that was the key. And why was it? Well, join me tomorrow and we're going to go into exactly all the different things that I did with Brandon with music and how that made all the difference in the world. And also I'll tell you what happened to Brandon. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you tomorrow.